Good evening. My name is Barbara Pally. I'm the Senior Director of Education at Cool Culture, and it's my honor to welcome you to this event, the launch of the second Laboratory for New Audiences. The Lab is a year-long program which will engage museum professionals from 23 New York City cultural institutions in designing innovative solutions to reimagining the relationship between diverse communities and museums, moving from one of audience to one of collaboration. The Lab will support the leadership, innovation, and advocacy skills of museum professionals so that they may advance cultural equity through our work together. The Lab will create opportunities for museums to learn directly from community, with direct interaction with diverse families and community-based partners that are a part of Cool Culture's citywide program. And I'm very excited that we have some of our community partners in the room tonight. In addition to learning from community, our lab participants will also learn from national thought leaders, like the ones on the stage. And so tonight is really a kickoff of that learning series that will continue throughout the year, which will involve exploration and experimentation together. So I want to invite, if you're a participant in the lab series this year, if you would stand just so we can recognize you. Thank you, welcome. And I believe we have some alumni here as well from the series we ran in 2014. Yeah, a doubleheader. Good, great. We look forward to continuing the work together. This work would not be possible without the support of the Institute for Museum and Library Services through an award of the National Leadership Grant Program, and we're excited to have Mark Isaacson from IMLS here tonight. We also thank our sponsor, Rework, and Director Abe, I think might be here as well. They're a progressive search and recruitment firm that has helped Cool Culture find a number of candidates that we wouldn't have found otherwise. We're also grateful for the continued and ongoing support of Manhattan Borough President Gail Brewer, as well as New York City Council Speaker Melissa Mark Vivaretto, who will have representatives here tonight. I believe President Brewer is going to stop by as well. We're also thankful for the support of the Matisse Foundation. And Cool Culture's fabulous board. I'd like to also ask them to stand. Your support is invaluable. Thank you. Additionally, we are deeply grateful for our partnership with the American Alliance for Museums, who's made a webcast and recording of tonight's event possible. So since the conversation is going to be taking place both in this room and online, we invite you, when you have a question to ask, we'll move this microphone down here. And if you're participating online, please do tweet your questions, and we'll call some of those at the end. Our hashtag is CCLab2016, and our handle is @CoolCulture. That information is also in your program. And before I hand the microphone over to our Executive Director, Candice Anderson, who will be moderating this terrific panel tonight, I want to thank members of the Cool Culture team who's really helped to put this evening together: Patricia Lannis, Marisol Cruz, Deirdre Hector, Adwa Niarco, and Haibin Lee. Thank you very much. And Candice.
Thank you, Barbara. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. Good evening. We want to get a kind of call and response going here that's reflective of the fact that we hope to have an engaging two-way dialogue. There is no overstating the amount of passion and investment in arts and culture and in the future of museums than we have here today in this room. Good evening, panelists. I am delighted and honored to be here with you today. The amount of experience we have and the breadth, as well as the investment in the arts and cultural sector, is really incredible. I'm pleased to be sitting amongst innovators. I'm not going to read their bios, but I will introduce them. To my left is Margaret Morton. Hello. Hello, everyone. She is the Program Officer for Creativity and Free Expression Ford Foundation. Tom Finkelpearl, who is the Commissioner of the Department of Cultural Affairs and the former Director of the Queens Museum. I feel like we get 2 for 1 with you, Tom.
That's right.
Miguel Luciano, artist, whose body of work includes pure platinum, work that commemorates the platino as a symbol of Puerto Rican and Caribbean culture, as well as Dreamer Kites, a public art project with undocumented youth that engages kites as symbols of flying and freedom. James Bartlett, director of MoCADA, I'm going to preemptively congratulate you on your new space. Woo! And Nicole Ivey, museum futurist with the Center for the Future of Museums at the American Alliance of Museums. Nicole, at the end of this conversation, I definitely want to chat with you about how to get a title as exciting as museum futurist, and I'm sure everybody else will as well. So our panel discussion today will last for an hour, and with, again, the intention of having a back and forth that engages all of you. We'll have 30 minutes for conversation and question and answers. And so I'm going to start us off. Our charge here tonight is to have a conversation about the role of cultural institutions in bringing about a democratic and equitable society, in effect, bringing about social change. And to begin, I'd like to ask one or more of you to reflect on the slowly emerging consciousness about the sources of inequality in our society and the urgency this brings to the conversation about the role of museums in our society. What, in your mind, are some of the social and political dynamics and movements that have resulted in us questioning the role of cultural institutions?
You're not going to call out somebody?
We could do a popcorn store or Margaret.
Questioning the role. Well, I will say, questioning the role, I think that one answer is we just saw with the opening of the new Smithsonian African American History Museum, the importance when there is a void in terms of creating, narrating history, and documenting history and documenting our history. We saw the great reaction to the opening from African Americans across the country, really from all Americans. And I think that was a great example of the importance of your work, of really making sure that we narrate and we capture memory and document memory, how important that is, especially for people who have a largely undocumented history. So I will.
Nicole, I know you're doing a lot of thinking about museums and labor as relate to the fight for 15 and other movements. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. Can you hear me okay? Yes. Okay, perfect. I'm Southern, so I tend to talk very loudly. Before I respond, Candice, to your question about labor, I want to weigh in. Hello. I want to weigh in on your first question about social and political dynamics that sort of cause us to question the role of cultural institutions. And it's related to the work that the Center for the Future of Museums is doing around museums and labor, and the work that AAM broadly is doing around museums and the workforce and labor. But, as a person who thinks about the future beyond sort of a 5-year strategic plan, but also as a person who has a sort of personal and professional interest in the past, as a, practicing historian, I guess. I think that this is not new, the idea of cultural institutions being prompted or having a stake in social and political change. That's not the new thing. I think one of the things that sort of refreshes that conversation or that has changed how, or some of the sort of cultural trends that impact the way that interaction looks right now is you think about sort of the trend of broadening of expertise. So the idea that everyone is a curator, right? Like we all curate our Instagram feeds, we curate our Facebook profiles, we curate information on our own. And so with this rise in open culture, I think that sort of trend toward openness, the trend toward open data, sort of, we see in museums making their collections available online. And there are numerous examples. I think that sort of trend toward openness and the broadening of expertise lends to sort of how museums are questioning sort of our role in cultural change. So that if the broader society is thinking more about accessibility, I think that sort of pushes us to think social change in a way that makes us think with our communities and not simply sort of as spokespersons or as sort of, right, the kind of temple, right, that communities come to worship in. And so to that point about the broadening of expertise, thinking about labor and the fight for 15, a lot of what we think about at the Center for the Future of Museums is what is the museum field going to look like 50, 75 years out. And a lot of that, hopefully will look like you in this room. The idea is that there are ways in which the pathway to museum employment really pre-selects who is going to be doing that work. Right? And so if we're thinking about the future, part of what we're thinking about and part of what I'm researching is how to figure out ways that museums can be more equitable institutions, ways that museums can reshape or improve our labor practices sort of internally so that all of our outreach and all of our sort of our role as cultural institutions responding to social change isn't just about getting them in the door, but really is about thinking critically about who we are, who works in museums, how are we paid, and what is that pipeline to museum leadership.
And if I could add to the thought about the shift in museums and its addressing social issues, I think one thing that is perhaps not completely new, but beginning to take shape is this concept of rethinking what is really at the center and at the core of what a museum is. Like, is it a static entity for preservation, or is something else at the center? Is something else that's more, I guess, addressing the needs of a constituency? And so, as more, social trauma and social issues kind of become at the forefront of our, community's consciousness, I think that it becomes more and more important for museums to, think about how they address those issues, not purely from the historical concept of what a museum is, but more from a future-looking concept of what a museum is, and what is the end purpose? Again, is it primarily preservation, or is it affecting change and affecting people's lives?
So if I could be very pessimistic, has anybody read the book Mounting Frustration? So it's about, go take a couple people. It's about the moment at which New York City museums were confronted by the Black Power movement. And so it was in the 70s, it was shows at the Whitney, the Met, and the Museum of Modern Art. And so it's this appalling story of missed opportunities, Harlem on My Mind being this terrible, by the way, which was attacked and almost defunded by the city, not because it was racist, which it was at some level, but because it was anti-Semitic. If you read the book, it's crazy, the story. Anyway, but one of the things that's terrible about the museum environment at that time was it wasn't diverse. Like all the curators making all these decisions were coming from a particular point of view, all PhDs from the same schools, pretty much all white, or all white, not pretty much all white. So when we did our survey of New York City cultural institutions last year, the single least diverse job in museums was curators, right? So it is this thing, we're curating our Instagram feed, we're curating, but the people curating museums need to be more diverse. That's right. And there needs to be a pipeline, there needs to be an active participation by the leaders of museums, by trustees, to change that dynamic. And it can be changed now. There are talented curators of color out there who need to be in those positions, and there need to be pipeline initiatives as well. So I can talk about what we're doing in some of those ways, but it's just appalling that we're at this stage of New York City, in this stage of our history, And we really haven't made much progress at all since those moments when what that book wrote about.
James, I want to go back to your question about what's at the center of museums and ask Miguel and others to talk about what we can realistically expect from museums in terms of the extent to which they can be agents of change and your perspective as an artist.
Well, I think, you know, I teach a class. I just came from teaching, like right now. I teach a seminar on Wednesdays about socially engaged art in the public realm, and at SVA, so it's not far from here. But it's a grad seminar. A lot of what we've been talking about in recent weeks is about sort of the capacity of art institutions and the art world in general to sort of be spaces that where we can sort of enact meaningful social change through our projects, right? And so, and increasingly, we have conversations about work that move into a public space that can access communities directly, more directly, right? You know, acknowledging kind of the historic failures of institutions to incorporate diverse audiences, right? And so, and you know, my experience at the Queens Museum was, you know, where I met Tom initially was through this initiative that was called Queens, the Center of Everywhere. It was a public art initiative that brought artists to do projects in the community directly to try to bridge the conversation between the institution and the community. And there are many examples like that, not enough, but I think one really exciting example, and it's also something that we talked about a lot the last couple of weeks, is the New Museum's project with Simone Lee and the waiting room. I mean, how many people got to see that project or participate in some level in that project? It was amazing. And it was, for me, it's a really exciting example of where institutions empower artists to really reshape and rethink those spaces for specific audiences. And so that project was about Black women and healthcare and about looking at the way that the healthcare system has failed women of color, right? And sort of prioritizing an audience and a conversation around these issues in general, but more broadly, sort of looking at a space that becomes active in creating like self-care initiatives, right? And so two things happen there, I think, that are really exciting, is that the artist is really empowered to redefine and reshape that space. So bringing artists into the conversation and sort of asking artists directly, like, where would you like to actually, see change in our institution? How can the institution be sort of like an agent in this broader kind of project of social engagement and social change initiatives? And so for me, that was the most exciting, most progressive example I've seen in recent memory in a museum space.
Margaret, I wonder from your perspective, I know that you have a bird's eye view of looking at cultural institutions broadly. What kinds of support do you think are necessary to bring about the kinds of projects that Miguel is talking about, or other initiatives that you've seen that really sort of shift power dynamics?
To answer both your last question and this question, I actually see artists and artists in the field, which has been historic, really pushing this notion of social justice work. And I think that it's really going to be from artists and, as Tom says, from curators, really affecting the content that will eventually find its way to institutions. There have been institutions like Queens that have been a leader in presenting that work. But I think we're seeing more often than not, artists really leading the content, raising social justice issues through their work, challenging issues from mass incarceration. I spent a day with artists who are doing work around the country on addressing mass incarceration through creative practice. So I do think that that foundations are also responding to that need as well. I think we see it in the public sector. We obviously see it through Tom Finkelpearl's leadership at Department of Cultural Affairs, raising up through funding priorities, the idea of supporting everything from immigration issues to incarceration issues, and we see it through funders now. Our strategy at the Ford Foundation through in our Arts, Creativity, and Free Expression program is really to raise up work from the margins, creative work that has the potential to really sort of shift the issues that drive inequality. And that is our primary strategy. I think we all know Darren Walker has been a great narrator of Ford's turn to inequality and has really talked through his evolution in recognizing that inequality is the sort of principal problem that he's seen across continents. So I just think that there's a recognition among philanthropy that we have to start focusing our resources, including arts and creative resources that we know can be transformative.
So yeah, and I think what Ford is doing is absolutely amazing. I think so the worry that I have, Miguel, for the kind of thing you're talking about is that it's like a special exhibition moment, right? And then things kind of, there's a new trend and we're back to abstract painting. By the way, I love abstract painting. And by the way, abstract painting can have social content as well, as David Hammons has proven.
That's right.
But I think that the institutions have to change. And they have to change at a fundamental level, from the board to the staff to the idea of what it means to walk in the door. Are you welcome? Is this place for me? And that's actually something at the center of this organization. But it can't be just the next kind of cool trend of social practice, right? Because it's going to come and go like it did last time. And we can't let it happen this time, right? We have an opportunity. You got, Darren Walker's the head of the Ford Foundation, right? We have progressive people in place right now for how long we don't know. We have to take advantage of it. Everybody in this room has to take responsibility in your institution to see how you can push the needle towards institutional change, not just the special show, right?
Yeah, no, you're totally right. I mean, we talk about that. So at SVA, we have right now probably the most diverse student body in the graduate program that we've ever had there, and probably the most diverse faculty also. But that's only happened in the last couple of years. And we have new chair, Mark Tribe. He's doing an amazing job to really, focus on that as an initiative, as a politic in the program. And so it's a really exciting place to be right now. And so related to that, we were talking about, one of the things we're talking about today was Dred Scott's piece. Dred Scott, who also is faculty at SVA. He's doing a lecture next week, next Tuesday, if anybody's interested. But the piece he did with the flag, for example, that says a man was lynched by the police yesterday. And it's a recreation of this historic flag that the NAACP flew. A man was lynched yesterday, and they flew that flag in New York in the 20s and 30s, right? And so his recreation of that flag and the controversy that it created when it was flying outside of Shainman, that forced it to go back inside, versus be a public statement. It had to be an object in the gallery because the landlord challenged it, et cetera. We talked about that as an example also of where some of the responses were, that flag should be outside of MoMA, and outside of other spaces. Other institutions, should be flying that flag. And one of the concerns was very similar, is that's great, but not if it's just a symbolic gesture alone, right? If those institutions are willing to sort of support that action with a community space for conversation and engagement, and look sort of at how issues of systemic racism are even a part of their own institutions and their institutional histories. It opens up a lot of other problems and questions that are healthy things for us to talk about, within the art world. And that's kind of the same thing that we debated in this kind of small space, is that there is a larger responsibility than the gesture, but rather the continuation of the conversation in a meaningful way.
James, I wonder how you would respond to Tom's call for putting in institutional structures as you sort of build out your own vision for MoCADA.
Sure, absolutely. I want to kind of build on both of those thoughts, actually, because it's interesting. I think a lot about what do we mean when we talk about social change, and to your point about abstract art. I think it's important to think about social change both internally and externally. What are we trying to do outside, but also reflecting back on ourselves as an institution and our mission and our core. And an example I'll use is it's one thing to have an abstract, expressionist exhibition, but if you make a conscious effort to bring in groups of kids from public housing, in order to expand, concepts of possibility and creativity, I think that's just as much a form of social change as, presenting something very overtly addressing, a social issue. And so, the more I think that we can think about it as an expansive idea as opposed to a limiting one, as opposed to shrinking what we can do because we have to be socially oriented. I think we can think of ways to infuse it into all the things that we're doing as opposed to how do we focus on this as a thing in and of itself.
Nicole, what strategies do you see people trying?
Well, you said the thing that I was thinking. My question, Tom, well, first of all, Tom, you read my mind because I was totally thinking about the book about the Black Panthers and
Mounting frustrations.
Thank you. I was totally, I was going to say mining the museum, and totally thinking about mounting frustrations when I was thinking about the fact that this is not new, the idea of, museums taking on social justice questions. But I also want to respond to your question with, sort of a question form of what you just said. What does institutional change look like? So that's it's a powerful term, but I think about, I like your challenge of expanding what we talk about, or what we mean when we say institutional change. But I also have the tension in that is to figure out how do you make such an amorphous, or such a potentially amorphous term as institutional change translate into something actionable. So I think immediately of Darren Walker's op-ed in the New York Times about internships, right? And that sort of one lever where you can have institutions really effecting some change there. And that's a pipeline issue, right? It's a training and performance support issue. So I guess my response is to ping it back across the panel again. What does institutional change look like? Especially for, working with AAM, so many of our museums are, small. So people have staffs of 1 to 3 persons, and the institution, right, is not super expansive. So I'm also thinking about the small museum community when I'm thinking about institutional change, and what are some of the ways that we can make that real? I have some ideas, but I'd love to hear what folk think about it.
So, with the, I don't know if people heard about the CUNY Cultural Core. So we just launched a couple of weeks ago a new program, which is a partnership with CUNY, which is placing 85 CUNY students in cultural institutions this year. There are going to be more next year. It's a partnership with the Rockefeller Foundation. Paid internships with both training for the interns and training for the sites. To say, and CUNY, by the way, we met the students. It was like super incredible, diverse group of amazing young people from all different backgrounds. And so there's that, so get in the door, like every time you open the door to a non-paid intern, you are closing the door on somebody who can't afford to do it. And, I've talked to Darren about it, and he said, people are always, so at the Ford Foundation, everybody has to be on financial aid to get the paid internship, right? And so he's, somebody calls up and says, my niece needs an internship. And he says, is your niece on financial aid? And he's like, oh, no, but I get it, and So there's the pipeline question. The other thing I was thinking, I was just talking to Thelma Golden. This is something she's talked about in public before, so it's not some secret. One of the things that they've done at Studio Museum is that's a small organization with only a couple of curators at a time. The idea at Studio Museum is you come and you're going to be, kicked out in a way or sent on your way after about 5 years. So they've been sending curators out into the field to places like the Art Institute of Chicago or Museum of Modern Art or the Hammer Museum in LA, one after the next, and they're investing a lot of time and energy and money and training with the conscious idea in their small institution of seeding the country with talented, mostly African American, but not all. Actually, there's a very talented Asian American curator came through there as well. So those are some of the kinds of programs But I mean, institutional change also I think has to do with your relationship with the staff and with the audience. It is a collaboration with the audience rather than are you actually willing to listen to your audience or your audiences. I mean, I can go on and on about this, but I think I was on a panel recently and somebody said, it's not a numbers game. And somebody else said, well, yeah, it is kind of. Yes, it is a numbers game. If in America right now there are no chief curators at museums who are African American, that's a numbers game. If the number's 0, it's still a numbers game, right? I'm talking about not counting culturally specific institutions like Studio Museum. That's a fact, right, in America?
To build on that, I'm struck, Nicole, by your posing the question, what does institutional change look like? And Tom, your response that part of that has to be sort of being very intentional about building a pipeline of diverse museum professionals. And I'm also very aware that there are many folks in this room that we'll be working with over the next 10 months who are also very, very much interested in concrete ways that they can make changes within their own institutions. And so what would you advise them in terms of best practices? What are some of the essential strategies that they can engage in that will promote equity within their institutions that they should be thinking about?
Well, I mean, Tom has talked about curators, and we are focused, a couple of the areas of interest that we're focused on is investing in organizations that are otherwise aligned with our strategy that need help diversifying their content staff and curators. We're doing that with a museum in Detroit that is committed to social justice, but is creating a diverse curatorial fellowship program. And so we recognize we need to help certain institutions to really strengthen that base of curators. We also, though, think that critics and journalists are really important because there is a dearth of diversity across the board in terms of journalists who write about the arts and culture, and also in the media in the media and journalism field. So we are looking at different practices to sort of help build that base as well. I would also just say that I think that for me, not to become obsessed about how do I help large institutions, we try to focus on those emerging institutions that are providing diverse content, including organizations like MoCADA. We are helping Brian Stevenson create the major museum in Montgomery, Alabama, which is dedicated to the 4 phases of discrimination, racial discrimination in this country, starting with slavery. That is going to be a major institution and will be the most diverse museum that we have, because part of that will be a memorial to lynchings that occurred in the South that we know are completely undocumented. And that is part of a Truth and Reconciliation Act. So I would just say, as you do your work, as you work in your field, embrace the diversity and how your field is changing, how museums and art spaces are changing. They may not be called museums. And that recognize that your field, I think, is adapting to this change that we're seeing now.
Nicole, what would you add?
Well, Candice, and everyone, let me be honest. I have been turning this question over and over in my mind. What can I say to a cadre of museum educators who know so much more about your institutions and what your institutions need than I do? So I can start by offering some suggestions, right? Like for those of you who will be working with interns, think about ways that, or let me take a step back. For those of you who are going to be doing hiring, think about ways that you can reduce unintended bias in your own individual hiring processes, right? So how can you lead institutionally from the positions that you have? That's one suggestion. And you know, there are a number of kinds of supports, and I could go on and on, that that AAM is looking into, that the private sector has looked into, including, you know, everything from like algorithmic reviews of job description materials. There's, you know, a whole host of supports. So that's one thing, like thinking about how you can reduce bias in the people that you hire. In that same vein, you know, from your own sort of specific positions, thinking about ways that the people you train are not just sort of people who look exactly like you. And that is a challenge, right? Because we tend to select people who have similar experiences, but how do we sort of broaden that breadth of experience? So those are two things that I would offer. But that's a sort of general set of suggestions. I think they're important steps, but only you all know what you can do in your individual institutions. And so I would say, I got this from actually a very brilliant colleague of mine, Sylvia Hollis, who is a historian and a museum professional, who told me, you know, archive what you do, right? So there's so much that like I can't tell you, but there's so many innovative ways that you all within your own institutions, with, you know, with the things that you all do as leaders every day that, you know, we may not know about and that you all may not know about. So archive what you do, share what you do, believe in the power of the institutional memory that you are creating by doing the work that you do at your institutions as educators.
I have a suggestion. Yeah. All right. So you're going to be in this program for how long? This group?
10 months.
10 months. So get to know the people you don't expect to get to know of your cadre, right? Because you're not at the top level you're not directors of institutions. But all of my, you know, the incredible richness of my experience in New York City has been just the people that have been around for year after year and comparing notes and trying to get out of your box, right? So get to know the people you don't expect to get to know in the group, right? Start with your own group and cross as many bridges as you can within your group.
I have a question. Are there any other artists here? A few? Yeah, a lot. Okay, great. So one of the things, I mean, it's also great to see in the audience, like several people who work with education programs, with different institutions that I've worked with, and people that I love working with, people I've been really encouraged by. Encouraged by because of their politics about community and communities and working with communities. And so I just want to suggest that artists too, as well as curators, as well as anybody who is connected to a museum that they love, should think of themselves as a stakeholder. And so one of the museums that is very near and dear to my heart is el Museo del Barrio, for example. I live in East Harlem. I grew up going to that museum. But before I lived there, long before I lived there, I see many people here who have been a part of that museum's history. But that's a community-based institution, you know, that was started by artists and educators and community organizers and activists, and has grown to be an amazing institution. They don't have a director right now. They're looking for a director. And we, I can say informally as artists, and what's that? Yeah, so, but we as artists are, I think, and sort of like community members think of ourselves also as like stakeholders and people who are really invested in what's coming forward and what the future of that institution will be, and in thinking about its history and politics. And I think that there are different kind of levels of engagement that we can think of ourselves as actors within. This is just one example, a personal one, but those things are very meaningful to me in terms of you know, thinking about what is the capacity of artists to actually have representation on a board level, you know, as people who have community interests and community connections, as educators and artists, to have representation, you know, at a board level that can impact conversations and politics within the museum. I mean, these are things I'm very interested in. I think that they're possible and really, really important.
I think we've heard a theme in terms of sort of leadership, right? In terms of meeting other people outside of your circle, We've heard a little bit about the role of artists. Margaret, you talked a little bit about your role as a philanthropist. I am curious about the role of collecting the thoughts of a broader public, of community. And Tom, I know this is something that you are doing as part of the New York City Cultural Plan, and wondered if you would speak to that.
Yeah, so the first ever cultural plan for New York City, comprehensive cultural plan, is underway. We're going to kick it off quite soon. We have consultants, Hester Street consultants. There's a team. So we have the opportunity, and everybody in this room has the opportunity to help influence this. Like, how can we make New York, New York, this idea that New York is dead is crazy, right? I know it's expensive, but everybody in this room is still here, right? And artists are still coming in, and more people are staying in New York City and not leaving. But there are worries, like this worry about the price of New York City is the biggest worry that we all have about our future. But there are other things that are being done in city government. We're doing artist in residence at city agencies. We are, working on artist housing, like on the model where Miguel is living right now, up in PS 109 East Harlem. There are a lot of things that we have to think about in terms of the future of the cultural life of New York City, not just our agency. And Nadia, how do they? So Nadia, stand up. Sorry. She's a staff member at the Queens Museum. Do you hear me? At the Department of Cultural Affairs, who's going to be the cultural plan coordinator. So people can put how do they get themselves on the mailing list?
Yeah, you go to create.nyc.org and sign up for the mailing list, you get updates from us.
Okay, and then it's up to you to participate in the future of the cultural life of New York City through this plan. We want your input, yes.
Fantastic.
Thank you. I should know that, right?
James, what would you add to that in terms of the engagement you're doing with community members?
Engaging community members?
Yes.
I mean, the first thing that always comes to my mind is that the institution should, as much as possible, reflect the community that it wants to serve, right? So if it wants to serve a diverse community, have as much as possible a diverse audience. If it wants to serve young communities, hire young people. And one step beyond that is engaging in dialogue actively with the communities that you want to serve. So we're a very small organization. Our total staff is about 10. And yet our mission is about the African diaspora as a whole. So even though we reflect portions of the African diaspora, we never think that we can speak for the African diaspora as a whole. So we always try to bring in diverse voices as curators, diverse voices to consider programming. And so look beyond yourselves as well when thinking about programming, how to serve, et cetera.
Thank you. Margaret, I know we had a very interesting conversation about some of the organizations that the Ford Foundation is supporting, and I would include among them the Smithsonian Asian American Center, and the requirement that they de-emphasize facilities, right? Because they do not have one right now.
It's without walls. This is a center that's part of the Smithsonian, the South Asian Pacific Center. And they are really dedicated to just doing work outside of their walls. Sometimes they do curate the beautiful buildings of the Smithsonian, but more often than not, they do pop-ups, they do sort of street festivals, and they do work really all over the country. They had an exhibit last week downtown in a long-time Chinese store that was closing on Lower Broadway. They did a pop-up exhibition there with artists to really call attention to the fact that this was a long-standing business in this community for 30 years and what happens next. What also strikes me about their work is that their work is intersectional. Their work is intersectional without calling attention to the fact that it's intersectional. So even though they represent South Asian Pacific people, they include artists, mixed biracial, cross-sector, cross-sectional artists of color without speaking to it at all, recognizing that this is part of their cultural heritage. We're really struck by that. Intersectionality is another area that we see emerging through artists and through creative practice, and something that we're watching with great interest.
Thank you. I know for some of us it is challenging to watch what we might feel like is a bit of inertia in the field, but there are radical practices that are out there, which is really exciting. And I want to turn again to sort of Nicole's interest in providing one actionable item that people can take away from today's conversation before we open the floor up for questions in about 10 minutes or so. So I wonder, for all of you on the panel, what would you suggest as one thing that people can do to sort of position museums to be more relevant? What kinds of strategies might they utilize in their own practices? Miguel?
I just say, talk to artists, engage artists, involve artists, in meaningful ways, not in sort of token gestures, but in ways that, that mean we can have a seat at the table, and artists that have community interests that the institutions really need to work on, especially.
I would say, it's a tough one. Don't be married to what you have been, and think about, start from scratch almost in a way. Instead of thinking about the museum as a building, as an entity, think about what you want to do and what is the best path to get there, right? Who do you want to serve? How do you want to affect change? And work backwards from there, as opposed to, we have a building, we need to fill it with art, and then how do we do other things?
Can I just add one thing? I just want to say, also talk to the people in your own institutions, because some of the people that I've worked with in education departments and public programs are amazing, but I sometimes feel like they don't have the kind of power at those institutions that might actually radically transform those institutions. And so that's really, I think, some of the resources are there. Not enough of them, but some amazing people are there already that just don't have enough power yet.
Great, thank you. Margaret, Tom?
I guess I would say trust the expertise of people who you don't typically imagine as having it. And that can be applied to how we think about curatorial authority. That can be applied to how we approach education work. It can be applied to how we approach hiring and training. But sort of, I think, in line with calls for more openness and calls for access and inclusion, right? Trust people who, may not necessarily have a museum studies degree, right? Trust people who may not bring the kind of expertise that we identify as being sort of art historical by virtue of their particular majors, but can read an image, can understand an exhibition, and can make meaning. That's what I would say.
Thank you.
I mean, I would just add the obvious, which is to think about access and to think about access broadly. You're working with people who, as Tom or Miguel said, may have long history with your organization, but look at access and question it. Question whether people with disabilities are really being served. And obviously issues of diversity and are clear, but question access, question how closed your facility is, how closed off it is, and look at those issues, because often your colleagues may be overlooking it, and it's your new set of eyes, and you bring value in that way.
Yeah, it's funny because actually the last two statements were exactly what I was going to say. So that's easy to say, right? Because they were so smart. But I'll just put a little bit on top of that. So one of the things I was thinking about in terms of those other levels of expertise or trusting expertise of other people, there's also, we found at the Queen's Museum that community organizers know a lot about community organizing. Guess what, right? We're not trained in community organizing. So we found it highly valuable to have some community organizers on our staff. That, look around your museum. Don't just hire the next art person who thinks they can do outreach, right? Outreach is the wrong word anyway. Community organizers don't do outreach. They do community organizing, community engagement. And then just as you were beginning to speak, Margaret, I looked over and saw our old director of art access, Michelle Lopez. So that idea, include in your vision of diversity, art disability.
Yeah, that's right.
Right? We have to open our minds. First, there's a default mode, and when you talk about diversity, to think about race. Yeah. Absolutely, super important issue. We have to always, and Darren Walker wrote a very eloquent letter about this recently, about his own shortcomings in terms of having thought about disability in terms of what his initiatives. Not thought about it. Exactly, right. So anyway, those are my two. So it's actually exactly what you guys were saying, sort of.
Great, thank you. There's a through line here, I think, of the idea of building connections, right? And sort of opening yourself to new alliances, which is a really nice one, prior to opening the conversation up to the group, which I want to do as per our promise that we wanted to have a shared engagement and conversation. So I know we have some questions perhaps from Twitter, but also why don't we start with folks in this room who might have questions? Okay, great. Yes. Will you just state your name and your affiliation?
She's supposed to have a mic.
Oh, Upper Manhattan Empowerment
You need to speak into the mic.
I'm very, very loud. Okay. So, Cheryl and Hava, I work with the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone.
Wonderful.
And I think we all know that board is a huge part of museums and their responsibility. So essentially, can you talk a little bit about what their responsibility and their role is helping to create more museums and cultural space?
So the idea.
Can you paraphrase the question?
Sure. I think your question is that Ford has a big role with respect to museums. Boards. I thought you said Ford.
You're hearing.
Hearing things.
You can address board.
Oh my God.
What is the board's responsibility?
The board of directors.
Yes. In governance, I mean, the board's responsibility is certainly, governing the institution, making sure that they follow nonprofit law, that they're complying with, their bylaws, to the extent that, they have an influence on content. It is important for them to be more diverse, and obviously that's an issue that we know is an issue here in New York City and across the country for large institutions. I think there's very good work at play that Tom can speak to try to help institutions diversify their boards. It's a big challenge.
And I mean, the board's biggest job is to hire the director, right? And so that decision that gets made at a healthy institution once every 10 or 15 years sets the direction for all the other hiring, for the basic, so, having a board that is diverse is the guarantee at some level that you're going to have some kind of long-term commitment. But having a board, short of that, having a board that embraces diversity and embraces a progressive idea of what a museum could be is kind of the first step towards actual board diversity, but also the first step towards hiring that next director who's going to embrace diversity and to embrace progressive. So there's a lot of work that can be done. Well, but I mean, right.
Yeah, and
well, I mean, the other thing is you have to understand, when we're all talking about progressive institutions, I think we have to also recognize that museums can be enforcers of social division. That museums have been founded often by elites to reinforce their own community cohesion. And so that's a long way to go from that all the way to jump to, oh yeah, you know, it's all great and progressive, right? In a way that's not simply a passing fad every once in a while. But that's a fundamental question, of course, the board diversity question. It's something that everybody keeps working on, and I think that there's even less progress there, quite honestly. Now, Carnegie Hall took a step recently that was great, the first large cultural institution in New York City to have an African-American head of the Board of Trustees. You look around that room, it's getting better. Yeah, I'm on, whatever, 38 boards. How many boards am I on?
Sounds like
She used to be the lawyer for cultural affairs, so she knows the whole stats. So like 38 boards, I would go into these rooms all the time. And it's not pretty. It's a thing that a lot of the directors and a lot of the staffs are very concerned about. And some organizations are better than others, but I think there is progress at some level in certain of those big institutions. Like Carnegie Hall, congratulations to them.
Thank you. Yes, please, James.
Very quickly to that, I think one thing we don't talk a lot about when it comes to diversity on boards is socioeconomic diversity on boards. And you know, again, the boards in some way reflect you know, the constituencies that need to be served. Obviously, another huge role of boards is resource raising. So when I speak about, you know, socioeconomic diversity in boards, I'm also speaking about how, you know, pretty much universally down the line, you know, extremely high net worth individuals join very large organizations' boards and almost never join small $1–2 million organizations. So I think, you know, addressing that diversity gap is important as well to have a healthy, you know, arts ecosystem as a whole.
Yeah. Quite frankly, when I was at the Department of Cultural Affairs, I was more interested in helping smaller organizations of color build their board than large institutions becoming diverse. I mean, it was just, if you had to pick your priority, that was of greater need, as far as I was concerned.
I think that's a great segue to a question that's come to us through Twitter. And this is a practical question. What does institutional change look like, especially for small museums with 1 to 3 employees? How do you make this term actionable? Speaking of small.
Read it again, please.
What does institutional change look like, especially for small museums with 1 to 3 employees? How do you make this term, institutional change, actionable? Yes, James.
Coming from a small institution, not a little bit more than 2 or 3. I think it looks like growth, to be honest. You know, as a museum and as an institution, you know, attempting to affect social change, I think, you know, it's important to talk about size and heft. I mean, if you want to make change, then, you know, you have to start with yourselves, and you have to be healthy enough, and you have to be a sustainable organization, you know, in order to affect that change that you want. And so, you know, again, we're still extremely small, but, you know, we've doubled in size in the past 3.5 years or so, and we're, you know, as you mentioned, you know, ready to move into a new building in a couple years and hoping to double again. So I think it requires growth.
And for the person who's on the line who might not be able to follow up with that question, what do you attribute to the success in your growth?
I started with building a board. When I took over, it was a very, very, very small board. Now we have over 20 individuals. And as I mentioned before, you know, one of the board's, you know, kind of chief responsibilities is resource raising. And so, you know, as far as I know, you know, it's almost impossible to scale, you know, arts institution without having a strong board. So.
And how have you been able to balance this sort of focus on board members who have the capacity to raise funds, and to your point, your interest in making sure that you have socioeconomic diversity on your board?
Yeah. Well, I think because of you know, our unique origin story as a museum, as an institution. We were founded by a 24-year-old who some of you may know is now a city council member, and you know, started in a donated space on the 4th floor of a brownstone. And so we come from this very, you know, community-rooted space, and so we gratefully don't have trouble attracting, you know, individuals interested in that aspect of what we do. We're continually trying to stretch into the, you know, higher net worth, stratosphere, and are slowly but surely taking steps in that direction. I would love to see our board be more diverse along that spectrum, however. So for me, I mean, individually, it's always just been about, constantly recruiting, constantly, speaking about the vision of the institution, not necessarily, where we are, but where we will be, where we're going, what we're, trying to do, the change we're trying to create. And, individuals self-select, so.
Can I also just say that?
Please.
So in terms of the future of the institution, there's also quite a bit of city investment in MoCADA, that the new home is, got a lot of capital dollars that are coming from the city, from the last administration and this as well. And so that, often there's this public-private partnership aspect of it, especially in small cultural organizations quite around New York City. That's actually quite unique in New York. There aren't a lot of other cities out there that I understand that invest in capital dollars for the cultural institutions outside of maybe the couple of big city-owned institutions in these other cities when they exist. So that's something, it's actually kind of not what people think about when they think about our agency, but it's at least half the money that we invest in capital projects per year for institutions working on it with 200 capital projects right now worth hundreds of millions of dollars.
That's a great point. I mean, from a capital perspective, it would be absolutely impossible for us to, expand our physical presence anywhere near the way we are, with support from the city. So,
but it's also congratulations on building the board and getting ready and getting to take advantage of that opportunity, which is, I have been myself, out in Queens trying to build that board for 12 years. With lots of progress and lots of way to go for my successor. And you're doing it every day, right?
Trying,
yeah.
yes.
Any board members here who want to join?
That's right. See me at the end.
Candice, if I may add very quickly.
Please.
Because I've worked with some very, very tiny museums, small historic house museums, for instance, that do have arts collections, that might feel that path to growth and that sort of growth through capital campaigns, is super daunting. I would say as they are taking up these growth projects, to do something that is a different kind of growth. And so I would refer to actually Nicole Trevetti's question of sort of asking yourself sort of what is the history of my museum? Like, what has, particularly for these sort of smaller, older institutions that don't see themselves as part of social change, I think Trevetti's question was, if I can paraphrase it horribly, something about like, what is the history of my museum in Black communities? Like, start there and ask that question. And maybe that question, may not feel relevant, but I think it's worth asking. And then broadening out from that, sort of thinking about at the level, particularly at more, size-constrained institutions who are working on these other strategies toward growth, and thinking about sort of what are our institutional practices, what are our assumptions, who do we imagine that we're for?
Great, thank you. Yes, can you please come to the mic and?
Yes. Hi, I'm Stephen. My brother and I are artists, and we've been collaborating for 16 years. And we've been connecting with communities for the last 10 years. And I just wanted to say how important it was in our process to get major funding from the National Endowment for the Arts and the Knight Foundation to dream big and to do our biggest project ever through the Parish Art Museum. And that really enabled us to connect with 1,000 people in that community. So suddenly, for 8 or 9 years, we had connected with 1,000 disadvantaged people in communities, and then 1,000 over the course of a month. And since then, that created like a seismic shift in our practice. And since then, we've connected with 4,000 people, all from disadvantaged communities. So I just kind of want to say to museum professionals, artist projects, because then we've gone on and all these different museums that we're collaborating with and showing with, we're doing that project at those museums. So by getting major funding for artists and artist projects, you're kind of doing that same seeding process where you're creating this seismic shift in their practice, and then they can go out into the world and create those seismic shifts and bring those seismic shifts to different parts of the country. So I guess I'm just saying thank you, funders who are funding artist projects through museums, and thank you, museums, for getting major funding for those projects, because creating that kind of growth was so critical for us.
Great, thank you. So if I can restate that into a question, Margaret. I hear the question is, how does one go about getting funding for large-scale projects that might shift practices?
So we fund organizations, mostly fund organizations. However, there are organizations that do partner with artists, and so we will fund those where there is a partnership between an artist and an organization. At the Ford Foundation, we are about to have a process for inviting ideas at the beginning of the year for 2017.
Great, thank you. Other questions from the audience? Yes.
Hi, I'm Lori Rotzkoff, and I'm a board member at Cool Culture. I wanted to just build on a couple of thoughts from Nicole and Miguel about museum education and the future of museums. And who's the future if you're looking down 25, 50 years? Of course, it's children. I was wondering, Cool Culture is all about family engagement and young children. Could you speak a little bit about how institutions can think more intelligently and creatively involving children to advance the equity through arts and culture? I just wanted to bring in age, right, as a category of diversity, and speak to that.
I think it goes back to sort of looking at where the museum's plugged in, to which communities. The fundamental questions are the same about, which communities get serviced, and have access. And for that, it goes back to the questions of who works in the institutions themselves, that can, create accessibility for broader and more diverse groups of young people too, and young people that may also speak a different language. And so it's still, I think, the pipeline question or issue within about sort of like creating those spaces within the institution and empowering people involved. But I worked with Saturday program for a long time at Cooper Union, and that's an amazing program where college students get to teach free classes to high school students all day on Saturday, and it's like a college level class throughout the year. It's amazing. But what I really appreciated about being there was that Marina Gutierrez, who still works at Saturday program, her politic was reaching the schools that that the institution itself, the college, wasn't reaching, and also that other kinds of outreach programs weren't reaching, right? So what were the schools in New York City that had like the worst if art programs, if any, And so they were really, that was a deliberate politic of the program. And there were artists who were out there doing the work, basically recruiting students. And without that, without I think that kind of a politic, then those schools just don't get reached. So the politics have to shift. That's a really important part of it.
And the Saturday program was also about portfolio preparation as well.
It is.
Yeah. So it's bringing people up into art school. Yeah. Right? So not just teaching art classes, but changing the pipeline.
Sure, but from freshmen to seniors, and so really,
it's been there forever, right?
Yep. Yeah.
I think, Lori, I want to respond to your question in a sort of perhaps roundabout way, and think more about process, or I'll try to respond to you through case studies. So one of the things that we're working on and tracking a lot at the Center for the Future of Museums is the expansion of, or these real seismic shifts in education. So to your question about, so it's perhaps tangentially or I don't know, fundamentally related to questions about pipeline and employment. One of the things that we're really digging into, particularly with the hiring of our new Ford Bell Fellow in P12 education, is thinking about the museum school. So there are a few cases where museums have started to have schools within the museum. And that's sort of a case study or a kind of more pragmatic example of a couple things, of like sort of museums really sort of getting in front of the trends in education currently. So the trend toward personalized learning, experiential learning, you know, less seat time for young people. And so you talked about Cool Culture's mission of really working with young children and families. I think museums as institutions have a real specific advantage as sort of, you know, as part of our nonprofit mandate as being sort of educational centers. So there are ways that museums are flipping that question about museums, education, and the future to really think very promiscuously and creatively about the future of museums as institutions. So thinking about what does it look like to host schools inside of museums. The other thing I'll say is another sort of trend that I'm interested in and that my colleague, Sage Morgan Hubbard, who is the fellow that I mentioned, the Bell Fellow, one of the things that she works on and that we've been sort of collaborating around at CFM is what does it mean to think early child education in a lifelong learning continuum? So what kinds of educational needs are continuing learners, elders needing? What kinds of learning needs do sort of persons beyond the age of 21 who might have been who might be formerly incarcerated? Like what kinds of educational needs would those people, would that community and constituency need from museums? And so that probably is a, again, I've given you sort of a set of cases or projects, right? But I think that's something I think I want to respond to your question alongside the thinking about education in terms of sort of training and education for museum work, but to think about the ways that museums are very creatively rethinking what it means to do education work.
Mike.
My name is Taylor Scott, and I just, thank you. I just wanted to
there are
thank
rules here.
the Commissioner for mentioning a group of, we're talking diversity here, and you raised the issue of disability. And you're the only person who's actually spoken to that, but I think it's a very important group of people. And now with an aging population, we're not only talking about diversity, about disability among young people, but we're also talking about an ever-increasing percent of people who are disabled for any variety of reasons. And normally when people think about disability, they think, okay, accessibility. So if we have put in a ramp, or if we have an elevator, then we are dealing with disability. But it really can go so much further than that, and an ever larger number of young people who need access to the kinds of services that you as a community are offering. So I just want
And I think actually Margaret was getting to that as well. Do you want to say something?
no,
Then I'll
go
say
ahead,
something.
and then-
So, I mean, yeah, so look, I've said this before, we had a very active, diverse, and large audience of people with disabilities at the Queen's Museum. We had a special program, we had our therapists on our staff, everything. But, you know, accessibility is not enough, right? It has to be openness, it has to be inclusive design. And it's not just design, it's not just a physical question. It's like, are people truly and honestly welcome and participating in your organization in a fundamental way? And it's the same question with racial diversity, quite honestly. It's just that but diversity just reverts to race, not naturally, and that's unfortunate. But Margaret actually brought it up before I did, so I wanted to.
Yeah. No, I appreciate you bringing it up. It's about, it's obviously about space and access and mobility, but it's also about the ability of artists to participate who have disabilities. We are actually starting to, because the arts sector, I think every different genre has different issues of how disabled artists can actually fully participate and their work be lifted up. We are fortunate to be working with Dance NYC, who is doing a request for proposals for integrative dance for the first time, and we're looking forward to sort of, what comes from those proposals, because apparently I am learning, I am a student, and there is amazing work in the dance world being done by disabled, or less abled dancers. So, thank you.
And I will just respond. First of all, thank you for your comment, because I think a couple things. It points to the limits of the term diversity. I agree with Tom. I think when you hear the word diversity, some people only think race. But I think, we've all been sort of using inclusion as a framework. And so when we think about inclusion as a framework and equity as a framework, that sort of pushes us toward, first of all, defining what we mean by diversity. Who, right? Are we meaning a sort of us, them kind of binary? And there are people who, you all do far greater, work. You know this work, right? I see Monica Montgomery in the back, right? She does all kinds of work around this. So thank you for your question, because it points up the limits of not limiting out what we mean when we say diversity. And secondly, I'll say, sort of from a futurist perspective, one of the things that we followed, and Elizabeth Merritt, my supervisor and CFM's founding director, has tracked in the most recent issue of the Trends Watch publication, is the sort of future of disability. So when we think about, sort of long-range futures of who we will be as a person, that line between ability and disability is getting ever thinner. Yeah. So, you're absolutely right. Diversity, inclusion, equity among disability communities is not just about sort of access and building a ramp and being ADA compliant, but as a cultural field, right, we're challenged to think about what does the future of human ability look like, and what are kinds of innovations in human performance, challenging what we know as sort of the limit of ability, such that people who have sort of physical limitations are being able to route that through kinds of technological and particularly biotech means, right? To be able to accomplish feats that, sort of uncyborg humans aren't able to do. So, if we sort of want to get a long view of it, right? Like there's a way that we're challenged as cultural institutions exactly to do what you mentioned, which is to think beyond sort of access and compliance.
That's some good work. Question?
Hello? Okay. You kind of don't know where to stand. Hi, everybody. My name is Naomi Guerrero. I'm a Posse scholar and a founding editor of Gallery Girl NYC. And my question is for Tom. In the cultural plan for NYC, it's not a story, but my story is I'm from the Bronx, and I always say this. I had to go away to the Midwest, to DePauw University for college, to actually discover that the center of the art world was New York City, because I had never been to a gallery or a museum. And I was like, wow, this is so cool. Where did all this happen? And then my professors were like, what? You're from New York? You don't know this? And I was like, no, I don't know. So I grew up a few blocks away from the Yankee Stadium, and I actually was a college access teacher or college prep counselor in Washington Heights. And I saw that my students, who were mostly Dominican American students, parents were recent immigrants, they had the same experience that I had, and that's over a 20-year difference. And I wonder if in that cultural plan there is some kind of I always hear like, oh, politics have to change, or like these very general like statements. And no, I want like a plan. Like, what's up? When y'all taking us to the museum? Like, when are we going?
Right. So, first of all, I'm very sorry that you had to go to the Midwest to find this out. But no. So first of all, I mean, one of the questions would be, do you have ideas? You can talk to me anytime about this, or talk to Nadia. So look, I mean, one idea was the ID card, right? The municipal ID card. We're going to have 1 million people are going to have that in their hands soon. And you know that there's this cultural benefit. You get the free. Now, we've looked at maps. We have very detailed maps of exactly where people are getting the ID card. And a lot of people in Washington Heights, Upper Manhattan, in that area have the ID card and are getting cultural memberships. Now, it's not, whatever, you know, Park Slope is a lot more, right? Because those guys are already in that sphere, in that neighborhood. But so that was an idea to say, if you're going to put this card in people's hands, how are we going to make that something that opens the doors to cultural institutions and also interests the entire city in getting the card? But so, look, the subtext of, you know, create NYC or whatever is a cultural plan for all New Yorkers. If it's not for all New Yorkers, then it's a failure. So, look, we know that there's a disparity in terms of cultural participation in certain neighborhoods, and we've been really looking at that carefully. There's a group, think tank from the University of Pennsylvania called the Social Impact of the Arts Project, and they've been really, we don't have the maps on it, but I've seen some preliminary maps. It's very upsetting. And so then, obviously, you lived right near the Bronx Museum. The Bronx Museum is now open and free to the public, right? It's right next to the Yankee Stadium. What's the barrier? And one of the barriers, by the way, is the word museum. There's not a barrier when you say library. Did you know where your library was, right?
I did know where the library, but if that museum doesn't have a commitment, even it has a commitment on paper if you go on the website and the mission statement and all that, but if they don't have a commitment to the community and to serve the community, which they still don't, then, you know, and giving a second grader, third grader, fourth grader, fifth grader an ID card to get into a museum won't get them into a museum because they don't know about it, right? Like, it's a cultural, like my parents never went to museums, right? So they're never going to encourage, they didn't encourage me because they didn't know. So even if you give, you know, you have this ID and you encourage, like, you know, all New Yorkers to go, there needs to be like a system set in place because it's not happening automatically. People aren't going on their own volition, right? So you gotta think about those kids that, you know, are missing out on that and are doing other things.
Right. No. So, and another answer to that question. And by the way, there isn't a good answer because you're right. So I mean, I'm not telling you you're wrong.
My bad. I don't want to.
I want you to. Look, I work for you, right? We know that, right? Who pays my salary? You good taxpayers do, right? So, another thing I will say was a question. If we're in a dialogue, was there do you think adequate arts education in your school when you were growing up? Because one of the number one priority of the de Blasio administration in the arts is arts education in the public school system. And it all starts there, right? You know, that we have 1.1 million students. We're not doing a good enough job in, you know, exposing people to the arts. And part of exposing people to the arts is, you know, here are the museums, et cetera. So you don't have to answer that question. But I will say that there are some answers out there. Improving arts education in the public school system is one of the answers. But if there's a way to break through some of those barriers, you know, this is what we're doing the cultural plan for. The ID card, by the way, is not for second and third graders. You're absolutely right, but it's for their parents, right?
And while that's happening, take your parents to El Museo and MoCADA.
And Tom, if I may, at Cool Culture, we like to say it all starts in preschool.
Yeah, of course. And by the way, quality preschool, right?
That's
UPK?
Right. That's right, UPK.
Yeah, we got to get kids in there. There has to be good arts in UPK as well. So that's 80,000 students that didn't have pre-K 2 years ago are in the system now.
So I just want to add, before we leave that topic, that I mean, I think it's so important that the institutions, you know, hear that problem, right? And sort of figure out a way to address it directly, you know, locally. Like that's so, and that's the thing that doesn't always happen. Like I think that in general, that there's a lack of awareness of how these have been generational problems that are still sort of like challenges today. And so that's one of the challenges. But then the other thing I will say about the cultural plan, I'm on the Citizens Advisory Committee for it, and to the credit of where things are right now, I think is that one of the central questions is, who do you think will be left out? Who are you afraid will be left out? And that's a question that's been put to the committee to really address from the onset. And so, which I think is a really promising sort of like way to begin that conversation, at least.
Thank you, Miguel and Tom. We have time for maybe 2 more questions.
I'm like, get out of here. we decided we were going to create the lineup here. I'm Sandra Jackson-Dumont from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I am in love with cool culture. I would say the question I have is that a great deal of your discussion has been about curators. And a great deal of your discussion has been about board members. And I haven't heard much discussion at all about educators. And we're giving advice to educators. And I have to say, one of the things that we were talking, Miguel, you were talking about, this is just generational ill. And some people, the young lady that was just here was just saying that we have museums that are not accessible and that there are no passes. Many of your organizations fund passes at institutions. They've been doing this for quite some time. I want to know from you all what your insight is on how to elevate the discussion about the role that educators have played in systemic change at institutions. And I would also say that if you're talking about this issue of diversity, education has been the #1 gateway for people of color to have a presence in museums forever. It has, I mean, Laurie Sims, Thelma Golden, all these folks have come through education departments. And I just want to know what your perception is around how we're giving advice to educators who oftentimes have been the ones that have been the catalyst for much of this discussion. And so tell us about how you all think we might adjust and change that conversation and catapult this profession into more prominence, period.
I'd like to start by just thanking Sandra thank you so much for the work that you do and for this question. I don't completely have an answer because educators are so much smarter than I am about the work that you all do. So that's why I made the comment earlier about sort of archiving, and I'm committed to figuring out how to do that in whatever way I can, because the knowledge that you have about what you do is really important. And I am thinking immediately of a recent blog post that I read by the El Segundo Art Museum, where the first folk that they hired were the educators before they hired an HR person, before they hired a director, right? The first people hired at that institution were educators. And one of the things that the educators did was do exhibitions that traveled. And so to the young lady from Gallery Girl, is she behind the pole? There you go, thank you. To your question about, and so I don't have an answer, right? But as an example of the ways that the work that educators do is precisely insurgent and precisely supportive of the kind of community engagement that you're calling for. One of the things that the educators at El Segundo Museum of Art in California did was create and work with artists to create exhibitions that traveled to places where people live. So they would bring the art to schools. They would bring the art, like, oh my God, right, conservation, preservation, like they would bring the art off the walls and into community spaces. I also think about Pepón Osorio in Philly, and the way that like part of his art practice was to make installations that sort of travel, right, that like go to people's homes. And so again, here I am with case studies, right, and examples, but I think you're absolutely right. I don't have an answer, but perhaps some of the answer can be found in the case study model, in lifting up, and in institutions, right, lifting up the work that individual museums are doing to provide models and to create spaces for educators to sort of do that kind of important peer-to-peer learning.
Yes.
Well, I mean, my most meaningful sort of experiences with museums has always been through the education department, you know? And it's the educators that I stay in touch with and that I connect with, and the curators I'm friends with sometimes as well, but that's where the real work happens. And that's the thing that I'm most interested in. So, you know, I'm in Harlem, so we have a Museo and Studio Museum, both of which have like amazing education programs and education program histories. But what happens a lot of times also is that when budgets get squeezed, you know, education gets squeezed too, fast and first. And so I've seen educators sort of like drop in numbers sometimes, depending on how those budgets are affected. And you know, it hurts. It's hurtful because I've seen differences in how sometimes the program even gets shaped. You know, the most exciting kinds of programs that I've participated in have been those where educators and curators were involved in designing programs, and even sometimes in conversation with artists. But really dynamic kinds of programs that engage communities on different levels. And again, going back to sort of like the idea of looking at the resources within your own institutions and how valuable that they are, paying educators, you know, so that they can stay there, you know, and actually develop and be invested in developing innovative programming, you know. I mean, these are real concerns. And these are the concerns that for educators at all levels, you know, museum educators, university teachers, adjuncts. It's like, that's part of what it boils down to, you know, is like really investing in the profession so that people can really stay there, you know. But it can be the most dynamic part of an exhibition experience, you know, is when you meet somebody who is compassionate and understanding and makes the work come alive to you in a way that you never understood or saw before. And when you see that and experience, I mean, there's nothing like that happens, you know. It's like, and they're always the unsung biggest heroes of institutions that really, I really mean this, like that really are often the soul of an institution because they're invested, they care about what people experience, you know, on a grassroots level who come to that institution. It's not the people who give the tours to the, you know, to the fancier, you know, folks that come in to see the work, but I'm talking about the people who really, you know, you can impact for life, especially young people. Yeah, I could go on.
I would also say that.
And I'm out of order.
Why don't we hear you unless your mic?
I'm saying it in response to what you said. In building cool culture years ago, it was through the education program and process and area that it happened. But one of the things Gail and I noticed and worked with, there was tremendous fear on the part of staff in the education department in terms of pushing the program. They felt that those in the upper echelon would not be sympathetic and supportive of what they were trying to do because of the things that you've talked about. The boards would not be for this. We're looking at a different population, and we're fearful. We want to do it, but we're fearful. But through that, they worked through that fear. In different institutions, people had different strengths to move forward in their institutions with the program. And as one institution said, we're going to do this, other institutions did not want to be left out. So they said, well, maybe we'd better find a way to do this too. I'm skipping a lot of stuff, but it gets to the fact that you have to feel your own strength as an educator, that what you're saying has value, merit, and you can go forward with it, and someone will listen to you in the process. Lose your fear. There was so much fear in the education departments among the education staff people. They felt they were the lowest on the echelon in their institutions. So you have to break through that fear and move forward with the people who will move you. And one quick thing, Tom, thank you for all you're doing to change institutions. But we also have to get our universities to have required courses that our populations understand the fact that it's through the arts, generally, music, art, dance, all of it, that a society And if people understand that and understand its importance, they will begin to think differently, but we don't think like that. Now, I'm sitting down, okay.
Good winner. So I've actually been told that we were out of time. And so we're going to continue to have our conversation with some refreshments and some drinks afterwards. I want to thank all of our panelists. Please join me in giving them a round of applause.